we are going to be reading Helen's Big World, The Life of Helen Keller, which this is an autobiography of Helen Keller, who was deaf, blind, and nonverbal. And the top of the book here features Braille that actually says the title down here. We do not think with eyes and ears, and our capacity for thought is not measured by 5 senses. Helen's Big World, The Life of Helen Keller, written by Doreen Rappaport, illustrated by Matt Tavares. Helen gurgled and giggled in her crib. At 6 months she crawled and said, "How'd-ye?" and "Wah-wah" for water. When she was 1, she ran after a ray of sunshine. She loved the mockingbird's song and the sweet smell of climbing roses, but best of all was being on her father's lap and in her mother's arms. The beginning of my life was simple and much like every other little life. When Helen was 19 months old, an illness her doctors could not name struck her. When she recovered, she could no longer see or hear or speak. When her parents pressed her close, she knew their smell and touch, but she could not see them or hear them or say their names. In the dreary month of February came the illness which closed my eyes and ears. Gradually, I got used to the silence and darkness that surrounded me. Helen tried to figure out her dark, silent world. She used her hands to recognize objects. She used her brain to make up signs to let her family know what she wanted. Putting on pretend glasses meant father. Her hand on her cheek meant mother. But she could not make up enough signs to have her needs understood. Many times she screamed and kicked and ended up sobbing. Sometimes she hit the people she loved. My failures to make myself understood were followed by outbursts. When Helen was almost 7, Annie Sullivan came to teach her. Annie had been legally blind. After several operations, she could see again, but her eyes were still weak. Annie gave Helen a doll and with her fingers traced the letters D-O-L-L on Helen's palm. Helen thought Annie wanted the doll back, so she kicked and screamed. Annie gave Helen some cake and traced C-A-K-E on Helen's palm. Helen traced the letters back on Annie's palm. Annie gave Helen many objects and spelled their names with her fingers. I was interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it. Helen imitated Annie's finger movements, but she did not understand that she was spelling words or things that had names. Helen liked the spelling game, but she didn't like learning table manners. She tried to eat with her fingers off Annie's plate. Annie wouldn't let her. Helen screamed and threw her spoon on the floor. Annie forced Helen out of her chair and made her pick it up. Helen threw it on the floor again. Back and forth they went until Helen finally used the spoon and ate off her own plate. In the still, dark world in which I lived, there was no tenderness. One day, a month later, Annie pumped water into Helen's hand and spelled W-A-T-E-R on her other palm. As Helen felt the cold water, she understood that Annie was spelling the word water. Her face lit up, and she spelled W-A-T-E-R on Annie's palm again and again and again. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, and set it free. Helen touched the water pump. Annie spelled P-U-M-P on Helen's hand. Then Helen touched Annie, and Annie spelled T-E-A-C-H-E-R. For the next few years, Helen learned thousands of new words and practiced speaking them with her fingers from the second she woke up until she went to sleep. Annie also taught Helen to see with her fingers. Every day for many weeks, Helen touched a lily growing in a pot. She felt its pointy buds open and form silky blossoms. Helen smelled violets in Annie's hands and felt the warmth of the sun on her face, and Annie spelled each new word or idea. With her fingers, Helen felt the vibrations of a person laughing, a chick bursting out of an egg, a horse neighing, and a baby pig squealing, and Annie spelled each new word or idea. There is not a talent or an inspiration or joy in me that has not been awakened by her loving touch. Annie placed paper on a writing board with grooves. She showed Helen how to guide her pencil with her left hand as she wrote in the grooves with her right hand. Once Helen learned to write, she would not stop. From her journal, July 12, 1887. Helen will write mother letter. Papa did give Helen medicine. Teacher did give Helen peach. January 9, 1888. Apples have no edges and no angles. Apples grow on trees. They grow in orchards. When they are ripe, they fall on the ground. January 29, 1889. Astronomer comes from the Latin word astra, which means stars. When we are sleeping quietly in our beds, they are watching the beautiful sky through the telescope. The stars are called the Earth's brothers and sisters. Helen learned so quickly, some people called her a genius. Other people said Annie was the genius. Articles were written about Helen. By the time she was 8, she was famous. Helen liked writing with a pencil. She loved when Annie spelled books to her. But she wanted to read books on her own, so Annie taught her Braille. Braille uses raised dots for letters and words. Annie put pieces of cardboard with raised dots on different objects. She spelled words into Helen's hand as Helen ran her fingers over the dots and touched the objects. More dots, more words. Practice, practice, until she read as quickly as sighted children. At first, I had only a few books in raised print. I read them over and over until the words were so worn and pressed I could scarcely make them out. Annie took Helen walking in the forest, jumping in the salty ocean, tobogganing down snowy hills, bicycling in tandem, and sailing in a boat, and she spelled out each new experience. The wind rose and the waves chopped angrily. Our little boat swirled in the billows, only to be driven down with angry howl and hiss. Our hearts beat fast. Very few people knew manual language, so Helen learned to read lips. She put her middle finger on a person's nose. She put her forefinger on their lips, and her thumb on their throat, and felt their lips move as they spoke. And at the same time, Annie spelled what they were saying. Practice, practice, until Helen could read lips. Helen touched a person's face and felt their lips and tongue vibrate. Then she touched her own lips and tongue and imitated what she had felt. Practice, practice, until she learned to speak. It was my ambition to speak like other people. We worked hard and faithfully, yet we did not quite reach our goal. When Helen decided to go to college, most people said that it would be impossible for her to keep up with the work, but she was determined. Annie sat next to Helen in class, spelling what the teachers said. Most of the books Helen had to read were not in Braille. For more than 5 hours a day, Annie read the books and spelled them to Helen. She hurt her eyes doing it. Helen graduated with honors. Teacher read many books to me. In spite of repeated warnings from oculists, she has always abused her eyes for my sake. While in college, Helen wrote her autobiography. She explained how Annie taught her. The book was a great success. People marveled at how much Helen knew and what a wonderful teacher Annie was. But some people questioned how Helen could describe things that she could not see or hear. They did not understand that she could smell lilacs and roses and feel the golden rays of the sun on her face and the soft, springy earth under her feet. I have the advantage of a mind trained to think, and that is the difference between myself and most people, not my blindness in their sight. Helen read all kinds of books and met all kinds of people and thought about all kinds of things and spoke out about what was important to her. She spoke against war and against child labor. She spoke for workers' unions and for the right of women to vote and for justice for Black Americans. Many people did not like her ideas. Helen believed that words brought freedom, and she would not be silenced. I do not like the world as it is, so I am trying to make it a little more as I would like it. Helen starred in a movie about her life. She didn't like that very much, but she did like being on stage. The audience asked questions. Annie spelled the questions on Helen's palm, and Helen answered them. Sometimes Helen was funny. Does Miss Keller think of marriage? Yes. Are you proposing to me? Sometimes she was serious. Do you think women should go into politics? Yes, if they want to. Some people felt sad that Helen was performing, but she needed the money, and she felt good earning it. Helen traveled all over the world, giving talks on the needs of blind people. She spoke in people's homes and in large halls. She met with lawmakers and teachers and presidents. She insisted that eye doctors examine newborns. She insisted there be more books in Braille and better education and meaningful work for people with disabilities. The chief handicap of the blind is not blindness, but the attitude of seeing people toward them. For 49 years, Annie was at Helen's side wherever she went, helping her do the things she could not do by herself. Annie's health weakened. She died when Helen was 56. I often wonder what my life would have been like if she had not come into it. Polly Thompson was there to help Helen, but some people wondered how Helen would survive without Annie. Helen used the strength and knowledge that Annie had taught her to face the world. She kept traveling and speaking, always saying what she thought was important, until she died at the age of 87. I love my country, but my love for America is not blind. Perhaps I am more conscious of her faults because I love her so deeply. And that's the end. And at the very end, there's an author's note and an illustrator's note, more about Helen Keller and their research. Over here is a timeline of Helen's life. There are selected research sources that the author and illustrator used, and some more references down here if you would like to learn more about Helen Keller. There's also a website link down here from the American Foundation for the Blind that would teach you about Braille. And in the very back, there is a chart for sign language. Thank you.